Oh, hello, good evening. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Joey Quinones. I'm the head of the fiber department here at Cranbrook Academy of Art. Thank you. Thank you. And it's a real pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight. So I'm going to give a brief introduction, but before I give this introduction, what a wonderful opportunity to see so many alums from Cranbrook. And so Amanda is here. So at the end, if some of the alums can hang around, and especially the fiber alums can hang around, and we could take a nice group photo, I would really appreciate that. So it's a real pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. Bhakti Ziek is known internationally for work that has ranged from backstrap weaving to digital jacquard weaving. As I like to tell my students, she's an OG. She has been active in the contemporary fiber field for over 4 decades as an artist, author, professor, and lecturer. Her extensive exhibition record includes work in the permanent collection of Princeton University and the Museum of Arts and Design in New York City. Her writings on contemporary fiber have been published in many journals, including American Craft, Surface Design Journal, and Fiber Arts. She is the co-author with Alice Schlein of The Woven Pixel, designing for jacquard and Dobby looms using Photoshop. So she literally wrote the book. And she also co-wrote Weaving on a Backstrap Loom with her mother, Nona Ziek. She currently resides in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Ziek has an MFA from Cranbrook Academy of Art. She's a 1989 graduate of the fiber department, where she studied under Gerhard Nodell. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Bhakti.
Thank you so much. And it's a pleasure because I know most of you in the audience now. So I'm just going to talk to my friends. So I do think it's amazing that I'm sitting up here. I have been to so many lectures in this hall. It was a long time ago, but I still remember so many of them. So it's nice to have switched positions. And thank you, Joey, and thank you, the members of the fiber department. It's been thrilling the last 2 days for me to work with you, and I look forward to tomorrow. And then Laura isn't here, the head of the media lab, but she has helped me with some of the work for tomorrow. And then, of course, my teacher, Gerhard Nodell, and Ken Gross, his partner, they're sitting in the audience. So I am nervous. So I've been a weaver for more than 50 years, and I'm still infatuated with the looms and how they work. I'm going to talk about the different looms and how they've affected, and the changes in technology have affected my weaving. And I'm assuming that I was thinking that most of you wouldn't be weavers, but now that I saw who came in the room, maybe you all are. So you might know what I'm going to be talking about, and if so, you can just, you just nod along with me like I'm saying it right. And there will be enough time for questions at the end. I brought a lot of samples to share with the students, and half of them are on the table upstairs. And so some of them will be referenced in this talk, and you can go and look at them. So weaving has a really long history. I believe that it's gone back before written language. And whether you're looking at the oldest textile or the one that was just woven today, the principle of weaving is always the same. At the intersection of the warp, which is the vertical element, and the weft, and with each warp with each weft where they meet, the weft is the horizontal element, there's only 2 possibilities. You either have the warp is over the weft or the weft is over the warp. And for weavers like myself, that just these 2 possibilities allow the most complex imagery possible. And you probably all know that this binary relationship of threads became the principle that influenced our computer coding today. You don't need a loom to weave. You just need your hands and a pliable material. And this is an image from Susie Dunmore's book, Nepalese Textiles. Oh, there it is. So you probably did some paper weaving in grade school, though I doubt that they were as complicated as these representations of a takate structure using 3 wefts. You don't need to know, if you're not a weaver, you don't need to know the specifics of takate or satin or any of the other structures I'm going to mention. Just think of structure as food, and then as a system of interlacement, and think of takate as like pizza. It's a specific food. Lots of contemporary curators in our times and historians learned about structure from and made paper strips like this to study them from the brilliant scholar and curator Milton Sunday. Most of them never sat at a loom, but this type of paper weaving taught them the differences in construction. And this example is from Louise Mackey's incredible book, The Symbols of Power. So, like Joey mentioned, I've co-authored 2 books in my career. The first on the left was on backstrap weaving. At the time, 1978, I was Judy Ziek de Rodriguez, and Nona was my mother. And the one on the right was written with Alice Schlein, a wonderful, wonderful woman and weaver who lives in South Carolina, and that's on jacquard weaving. They represent like the polar opposites on the wide spectrum of weaving, of loom technology, and they encapsulate what draws me to weaving. That's my fascination with looms of all types. This Peruvian weaver was at the International Folk Art Festival in Santa Fe 2 summers ago. I hung out with her for really a long time, but we didn't talk. We didn't exchange any words. And I marveled at her patience and was reminded about the intricate textiles that are possible using the simplest of tools. In fact, this summer, when I went to the festival, there were 4 or 5 weavers all working on backstrap looms. And it was really fascinating because each one was slightly different. So a loom keeps the warped threads under tension. And a backstrap loom like this one has the weaver at one end creating tension against the other end, which is tied to something stable, like a doorknob, a beam on the house, a tree limb. There's no element to keep the threads spaced evenly, but most weaving that I studied on a backstrap loom was warp-faced. So the set of the warp, they were so tight together that it kept the width on the loom. Because I knew some indigenous weavers felt that photography was fairly intrusive, I gave my camera away the day I entered Guatemala. So I don't have any images of my own, but here's another photograph from Susie Dunmore's book, A Nepalese Woman Weaving on a Backstrap Loom. To separate the warp into the 2 sheds that form a plain weave, the weaver has a heavy stick with half the warps going over it and half going under it, and she has a heddle rod made with a continuous thread that's situated in front of the heavy rod. So the string heddles encase the warps individually underneath the heavy stick, and she's holding that stick in her right hand. If the weaver leans forward just slightly, she relaxes the tension on the warp and can pull that threads up. And then she it's a very, very simple but ingenious method. And this kind of loom really is still being used all over the world. When I think of the possibilities of disaster that could happen today, and I think that a lot of people today are thinking in that way, I'm so grateful that I know how to use simple sticks to make a weaving. Here's one of my backstrap looms and a weaving in process. I left Guatemala in 1976, and I haven't touched that loom since. Look at the beautiful woven strap that the weaver uses to be attached to the loom, and the patina of most of the sticks, including the beater. So my mother was really baffled by the packages of sticks that I kept sending to her house over the 5 years I lived in Guatemala. But those sticks, my looms, they were really precious and hard to come by. When I first got to Santiago Atitlan, which was my first weaving town in Guatemala, I found a teacher really easily because everyone sent me to Wani. And she had taught a young foreigner before me, and so she's forever the teacher in that town. But I needed the sticks of the loom to start my lessons, and it took almost a month before I found anyone that was willing to sell them. After that, anytime I found someone who was willing to part with their loom, I bought it. I learned weft brocade techniques in Guatemala, and I still incorporate them in my work today. Each town had its own form of supplementary weft brocade, and in those years, the weavers did not know the techniques used in other towns, even if they were neighboring villages. It's not true today, but when I was there, I could tell where somebody lived by their traje, the clothes that they were wearing. And I was really jealous because I only had jeans and they had these magnificent fabrics. You can see that the red striped warp is so dense that you don't see the ground weft at all, and that the supplementary wefts, that's the colorful motifs, they sit on the surface as if the cloth is embossed. Most non-weavers think the images are added through embroidery, and some villages did do embroidery, but the textiles that I studied were all woven. And so the cats and birds, they were created row by row, just as the cloth was created. The use of variegated embroidery thread was not my idea. In fact, nothing that I did in Guatemala was my own original creativity. I understood how important it was that I copied my teacher's fabrics, even using the same color combinations as she had. Every single day, a group of older women would come by to see what I had done. And they weren't just judging me, they were judging Wani as much as me. So even if I didn't like orange with black followed by green, I still did it to show my respect for her. And also, I always knew that I was learning something, and at some future time, on my own, I could use that knowledge in any way I wanted. So after I returned to the United States, and with the money I earned from writing the backstrap book, I bought my first floor loom. It was just like this, a Maycomber loom, only it was 56 inches wide, and it had 16 shafts, though we called them harnesses at the time. I didn't really know anything about looms, but someone had mentioned Maycomber to me as the best loom on the market, and they also told me buy the largest loom you can and get the most harnesses. So I did. Floor looms, also known as shaft looms, have frames, like the metal ones on this loom, that they hold groups of threads. And each warp end is threaded through an individual heddle that's on one of the frames. So when a shaft is raised, all the heddles, all the warps on that shaft lift, creating a space called a shed. where the weft or pick is inserted. You can see a shuttle holding the weft yarn in the image on the right, and it's ready to be inserted into the shed. So by stepping on a pedal, the weaver lifts one or more shafts and that are attached to the pedal. It's a little like playing the piano because arms and feet and mind are all involved. That year, I moved to Lawrence, Kansas, where I enrolled at the University of Kansas to get a BFA. They had an excellent textile program then, as they do today. And since I had a BA, I only needed to take art and design classes. I began painting my warps with Procyon dyes, using principles I learned in surface design classes. Then, as I wove, I reacted to the color changes in the warp with brocaded imagery. The little beater I'm using on the right to pick the squares is still one of my prized Guatemalan tools. The diagram shows you how a supplementary weft brocade is inserted after each ground pick and only works in a discrete area. Excuse me. I didn't work from drawings, but I would paint the warp threads very spontaneously and then let the color changes suggest the placement of motifs. In a way, it was as if the first pick set in motion everything. And then all I needed to do was listen, and the threads would tell me what to do. In this weaving jataya, the warp is actually horizontal in the finished piece. You can see from the detail how I tried to make the brocaded shapes interact with the painted warps. So in Journey, another weaving from that time, the geometric shapes became simple lines. And it was thrilling to me how those lines interacted and built areas of the embossed intensity in the same way that I loved the relief of the Guatemalan motifs. I kept trying to simplify the amount of brocading I was doing, but you can see in this weaving, Sugar Blues, that the lines just demanded that I add more and more. And each of these lines was a separate supplementary weft, inserted as I was weaving. So if I wove 1/4 of an inch an hour, I felt that the work was moving rapidly. And I can easily admit that I don't have that patience to do that kind of work today. So my loom had 8 shafts, which meant there were 254 possible combinations of lifting those shafts. But I was weaving plain weave, which only needs 2 shafts. And then I was adding the brocading with my hands. So around this time, it was the mid-'80s, after traveling around the world with my husband, Mark Goodwin. We traveled for more than a year and a half. I was in New York City doing word processing. I worked part-time for Jack Leonard Larson, and I was weaving on my Maycomber loom in our really tiny apartment. Although I considered myself a storyteller, my work began to be more explicit with the imagery. So in this weaving, I was trying to understand the energy system in our bodies that Hindus call chakras. I also enrolled in the first computer Dobby class offered in this country at Visual Arts. Although I could read drafts and follow instructions, I didn't understand the relationship between lifting the shafts, that's lifting the warp threads, and what was going on in the cloth. But that class began my understanding of block weaving, which led to this weaving that incorporated damask structure, where the cloth is warp-faced in some areas and weft-faced in others. The ground cloth is a painted warp, so I was continuing that process, and woven mostly as a warp-faced satin. If you look at the 2 columns of motifs in the center of the image, the ones on the left, the circle, there's a square, there's a triangle. those are brocaded. And while the T-shapes to their right they look like it, but they're more embedded into the cloth. And those are weft sateen areas. So, in other words, the ground weft shows in the sateen areas where those shapes are, and it's hidden in the satin areas. And then after doing the ground weft, then I did my brocading. So a weft pick did not travel across the across the cloth in one shed, right? I was constantly treadling different, like I'd lift things, then I'd have to change it and lift things, and I was going like this with my shuttle. And you can see that it was because of the way I was doing my imagery scattered all over, I was doing quite a lot of that changing of the shed. The back of this weaving, it's really interesting, is totally striped with color because I was changing the color of the ground weft that would show, but the warp was so dense that you didn't notice that, so it gave a uniformity to the ground. So this is an image of the AVL loom at the Henry Ford Museum here in Michigan. I don't know if it still exists, but I did get this image off of the internet. And Visual Arts had a loom just like this, except the Visual Arts loom didn't have a fly shuttle, which you would go like this to move the shuttle. You were just throwing the shuttle. And also the Visual Arts loom had a CompuDobby, meaning it was a computer was controlling the lifts. This one has bars, you see on the right-hand side. So what you did with a dobby was you pegged the bars. So each bar had the number of holes of the number of shafts that were on the loom. And in this case, I think it was 16 shafts, so 16 holes. And if you wanted a shaft to lift, you put a peg in it. So these bars enabled you to access on any pick in the cloth one of the combinations possible. And pegging bars is really time-consuming, and there's a limit to how many you can have on the loom. Like this has a very long repeat. Look at that long repeat of the pegs. But if it gets too heavy and it's hitting, you have to get some kind of a device to hold up pegs if it's too long. So here's the math. And I think most weavers like math. So on a 4-shaft loom, there are 14 possible combinations of lifts, from lifting 1 shaft, lifting combinations of 2, or lifting 3. So on an 8-shaft loom, there's 254 possible lifts. And a loom that has pedals does not have the room for 254 pedals. So you kind of make choices of 8 or 10 lifts unless you want to get down on the floor and change all of the tie-ups, right? So a loom like this with 16 shafts, 65,534 possible lifts. That's how many choices. And then the way you put those choices is an infinite possibilities. So it's interesting, there's a new AVL loom in the fiber department right now. It's got 24 shafts. And so for those of you who are going to work on that loom, I just want you to know, you have a choice of 16,777,214 combinations. So get busy. So when I began graduate school here in 1987, the fiber department had just gotten the 16-shaft AVL CompuDobby, and I was the only person that knew how to use it. So at the request of my teacher, I ran a project where everyone tried the loom. But in the end, it really became mine to use for most of the 2 years. I wove the Wheel of Life washerwoman Revelation using that same technique of changing the warp threads as I went across the web of the cloth. I had 3 warps on the loom, but I didn't try to do 3 layers. I only used 1 weft, 3 warps, and so I did combinations of how to lift all those threads. And first I did quite a lot of sampling to see what would be my color palette or my choices to make my motifs. And again, you can go up on the balcony afterwards, and I did bring a couple of those samples with me so people could see what I wove here. But because it was a CompuDobby, I had to program. I couldn't step on just a pedal to change the combinations. I had to program it in. And so I had to program a series of this weave structure, then this one, maybe back to the first one, back to the third one, a fourth one. And then when I got to the left side, I had to switch it and go from 4 to 3 to 1 to 2, whatever it was. And it was a nightmare. But it did enable the weaving I'm really proud of. And in Cranbrook, encouraged by Gerhardt, I turned more to narrative. Since I always had my stories in my head, the question really was, why aren't you letting the audience have more information about them? So during my first semester, our class, we went to Mexico for a year, and it was paid for by generous patrons in this community. I don't know if anybody in the audience was a patron, but if you were, thank you. So for me, that was a return to a country that I had called home for more than a year. And I was surprised to remember a mystical experience I had there, but I had forgotten it. Now, how do you forget an experience that is so out of the ordinary? And I was talking to one of the students about memory, and I do think it's really quite interesting how something so mundane can remain for years, and something so profound can get forgotten. So when I wove this in the middle section, I wove the story, the cycle of life that we all share from birth to death. And the smaller bottom band recants that mystical experience. And then the top band represents an event like the sun rising and falling each day that's gone on long before our species entered the planet, and it'll continue long after we exit. So I would say that the top band right now remains the most relevant to me. And when I think of geological time, it really does calm some of the panic I feel about our current time. This detail shows you how I combined the different interlacements of threads to create my imagery. This is another technique that I really don't have the patience for today, but it's a really fascinating way to work. And anyone interested in doing this on a shaft loom should look for Nancy Searles' book. It's Searles, Nancy Searles, The Techniques of Freeform Design. By the end of my graduate program, I returned to an 8-shaft Maycomber for my final work. By this time, because of the incredible lectures that Gerhardt gave on the history of textiles, I had learned about historic textiles that use takate or lampas or samatum for their structures. And I will say that just the names of those weaves, even today, they just give me joy. And they also resolved some problems I was having with tension on my warp from brocading big images. So what I did was I braided black warp and I discharged it. And then I braided white warp and I dyed it. So those are creating the color shifts that you see in the background. And I was, again, looking for speeding up my process. And I thought this will be faster than painting warps, which it wasn't. You have to braid 1,000 braids, and you have to unbraid 1,000 braids. But I do think it's really a great effect. I also, because of Lampas allowed me to do a back pick, so basically I was weaving with the colorful side, like you can see with the Buddha on the right. That was the side I saw. But then after every pick on the front, whether I brocaded or not, I threw this back pick. And I had painted images on my wefts. And then, so every panel had one side that was the colored vertical stripes, and the other side was the painted animals. So the weaving's title was The Wheel of Life, the Passing On of Knowledge. In the interior, I illustrated the story of how monks from Constantinople, under the direction of the Emperor Justinian, traveled to China with hollow canes in search of the secret of silk. They didn't know anything. They knew they loved silk, but they didn't know, does it grow on trees? Is it mined from the earth? Did it come from animals? So they watched silk being made, and they hid silk cocoons in their canes, and then they brought the secret back to the West. I like this story because it's part of the history of weaving, perhaps, and because it's a paradox. No one's right. Stealing from others, in my book, is immoral, and so is hoarding knowledge. It also is an illustration of how one culture learns from another, whether they acknowledge it or not. And there's always been an exchange of ideas and knowledge through textiles and trade. This is the configuration of the piece when it was shown last year in Santa Fe at a retrospective of my work. You can see that the panels had the animals on one side and the silk narrative on the other. It was really amazing because when I was weaving, I couldn't see if the back pick was really unfolding as the animals. So I can't tell you how happy I was when I took them off the loom and it was like, it works. Yeah. So in 1990, I got hired to run the woven design program at Philadelphia College of Textiles and Science. I remember my dean at the time saying, it's a problem when you define yourself as a cutting-edge technical college, but the Historical Society is requesting tours of the facility. So I feel that I really did witness the end of the Industrial Revolution. In 1991, they threw out all of the old jacquard equipment from the 19th century, tossed, and installed 2 state-of-the-art, fully electronic digital jacquard looms. And when they behaved, they were wonderful. But too often, we had to have people at both the front and the back watching things. So do you see the copper wires that are in the right-hand image? Every warp thread is threaded through a copper wire as well as through a heddle. And what happens is the tension of the warp will keep those copper wires up. But if a thread is loose or it breaks, the wire drops and the loom stops. They don't use shuttles. Cones of yarn, they call them packages in industry, are mounted on a rack and threaded through tensioning devices and into the loom. These looms had 8 selectors, which meant that at any pick of the cloth, you could choose one of 8 weft threads. And I know looms with these type of looms today have even more selectors. Wefts traveled from one edge of the cloth to another, but they always went from the same edge to the other edge. So they always came from the left to the right, from the left to the right. And so there was not a shuttle going back and forth, making bound edges, making selvages. It's not right to think of the weft as thrown. What happened is that there's a gripper, and it would pick up the weft from a selector, and it would take it in the shed into the middle of the loom, and a selector and a gripper from the right would come through. And so you always saw this motion, right? And then at the very edge of the loom, it's hard for you to read it in that, but there were razors, and they would cut each pick of the cloth. And then there was another little band of, outside of that, another little band of threads, like a ribbon. And it would catch the weft that was cut, so it didn't go back into the main cloth. So I was definitely in the right place at the right time for me. I could make work with details like the text of this weaving, which is an entire speech that I gave at a symposium in Chicago. I had complete freedom to change the design vertically, but I always ended up with 4 repeats because that's how the loom was set up, right? And so if you like this weaving and you wanted to read it, you could read it, and then you could read it again and again and again. And this is the weaving that's that's at the in the collection of the Museum of Arts and Design, unless they sold it. I don't know. So I want to mention that the first software that I worked on, it was created by a label company. So the tallest image you could create was like 6 inches, right? If you needed a larger image, this weaving was over 9 feet tall. You'd have to put them together, one file after another. I mean, it was really crazy. They had this technology that could do so much, so new possibilities, right? But the computer software people were constrained by old thinking, and by they weren't allowed to do that because the label company only needed that height, right? So what happened was that my school, because it was a technical program, got donations of 7 different software programs. So I had to teach my students all of them. That was my responsibility. So I had to teach them, hello, how are you? Hello, how are you? In 7 different languages. And it was extremely frustrating. So what I did for myself was I chose one of those programs for my own work, and then I used that exclusively. And so I could end up with that program making one big file for this 9-foot weaving. I really began to understand weave structures and their possibilities by using the electric jacquard. It's kind of ironic, right? My hands weren't in it, but finally I had to really think through structure, put it in a computer, and then go to the loom. Those of you who aren't weavers, when you see cloth and it looks like it's a simple plane, you have to realize you're really looking at a 3-dimensional object. And it's by thinking of that 3-dimensionality that I could conceive of the structures that I use to make these weavings. It's a double-sided weaving. I created it double-sided, intending to hang it in space so people would see both sides. In the rondelles, you see swatches from the historical textiles. And since I identify my lineage as the history of textiles, I put some of my own work in there too. This is one side of history of fabrics, Barbara Song, and the full image is on the left and your signet detail on the right. And it was named for Barbara Eckhart, who was an incredible weaver, went to Cranbrook before me, and she died way too young. And this is the other side of the weaving, and it has writing that you can read. So I scanned pages from my History of Textiles notebook, created during the lectures that Gerhard gave right here in this room. And I'm not exaggerating, well, just a little bit, when I say that I think about those lectures almost every day and how they taught me the importance of history. I love diagrams and the visuals of math, and this Chinese magic square has all rows, columns, and diagonals add up to 15. So learning history through the lens of textiles finally made worlds come to life for me. And in 1998, this was on the cover of American Craft. And I was so sad that my mother was no longer alive to know that, because she had a subscription to American Craft way before it was called American Craft. So at the same time that I was doing jacquard work at school, I was still working at home on my floor looms. I started asking myself, what's the appropriate language for each loom? I could do things on the floor loom, like inserting these supplementary strips of reed in my cloth, that I couldn't do in the jacquard. Also, by changing the warp density in this cloth, sheer in the center and dense on the sides, I allowed the materials and setup to become the language of the work. So in the summer of 1997, I was fortunate to study at the Fondazione della Seta Liceo in Florence, Italy. I was able to produce some hand-woven jacquards on 19th century looms. So the equipment that had been thrown out when I started teaching was there at Liceo and is still there. I had to design the fabric on special point paper and cut and lace the cards for each study. On the left, you see a piano cutter. So the cards are inserted one by one, and they're punched. So each card is going to represent one lift of all the warp threads. And you had to be really careful, because if you made a mistake, you had to find the hole that was wrong and fill it, or find the space that needed a hole and punch it. And you wouldn't know it until those cards were on top of the loom, which could have been 15 feet high, right? So it was not an easy task. You really tried to be careful. And then on the right, you had to number those cards because you needed them in the right order, and then you had to lace them, and definitely you got blisters on your hand. This is an old jacquard head. So on the right, you see how the cards are mounted on a square piece of wood, and that's aligned, perfectly aligned with the hooks in the jacquard. So the wooden cylinder has holes in it that need to match the holes in the cards, and the heavy device is mounted on the top of the loom. It's a little bit like Dobby in the fact that in Dobby you pegged the holes, and in the jacquard there were hooks that would go into the holes. So I was able to weave on several different looms at Liceo that had different configurations. So the textile on the right is a lampas, and the one on the left a patterned damask. And I have a sample of that one up there. It's fine if you want to pick up a piece and look at it, because textiles, sometimes when you move them, they look different. I loved the experience of working on those old looms, but I was really grateful that I had the computerized ones back at this college. Excuse me. So nothing in all my weaving experience has compared to this loom that's set up to weave velvet. So true velvet has a ground warp and then a second and sometimes a third warp that creates the pile. So to make a figured velvet, figured meaning it's going to have a motif in it, right? So each pile has to have its own back beam so it can lift and move freely independent of its neighbors depending on the motif. So that's what you're seeing, all those little bobbins is like a back beam for each of the warps, each of the pile threads. And some of the some velvet looms, like this one, had a Dobby head as well as a jacquard head. Here's the velvet that I made at Licio. The dark leaves, those are cut pile. And the gray ground is uncut loops of pile. And then the blue stems, those are areas of voided velvet where the pile actually weaves with the ground. Now, if you only have 3 shafts, a floor loom, 3 shafts, you can make velvet. You can do 2 for the ground and 1 for the pile. And if you paint or e-cut that pile, when you weave it, you'll actually see a design in it. But you have to remember to elongate the design. Because if you want a circle, you have to remember the pile's going to come up, over, down. So you have to elongate it to a shape 6 times as long, and then it'll work out fine. So I was tenured, but I left academia in 2002. I love showing people how to do things. I still do. And I loved enabling them to manifest their ideas. But I really hated grading, and I didn't want to give assignments. So I left. Anyway, I had files from those 7 different software programs that I had to teach, and I couldn't access them. And each developer had purposely created their programs so they didn't talk to each other. It's not like you could save a bitmap file and they would all open it. So, but I read this article by Alice Schlein that Photoshop had just come out with a feature that allowed your pixel to be vertical or horizontal. And in weaving, you know, a square pixel would mean an equal size warp and weft. But in weaving, often your weft is thinner than your warp, and therefore if it's thinner, you're going to have a horizontal pixel. And if your weft is thicker, you're going to have a vertical. And you want to design correctly so that a circle becomes a circle. So I contacted Alice, and we spent the next 2 years writing the Woven Pixel, which we self-published in 2006. So at the time, Photoshop, it cost about $100 for a program, maybe less, that you could put on your computer, versus the software that I had access to when I taught at Philadelphia. Most of the programs cost more than $100,000 per license, and the cheapest one was $30,000. I actually did start purchasing that $30,000 one, and after 2 months, when it was a question of do we pay our mortgage or do I pay for the software, I sent the software back. So I was so grateful to have Photoshop on my own computer, and I still have it. I have an old version because I don't want to go to the cloud. I just want it on my computer. So Alice and I stopped selling the book maybe more than 10 years ago. We just were tired of Photoshop changing the place. You know, something showed up under the edit menu. The next year it showed up under the file menu as a reason, you know, for people to have to buy new versions. We just didn't want to deal with it. So we gave the whole book to a site called handweaving.net. And it's still there. You can download the whole book for free, chapter by chapter. And it's really interesting to me because here it is, 2025, and it is still being used. Things have changed in Photoshop. There's no doubt that the look is slightly different, but everything we've described is in there and still useful. So in the spring of 2007, when Mark and we had built a straw bale house in New Mexico. We lived on 53 acres. It was pretty magnificent, but it was lonely. And we decided that we were going to move. But we thought, we have to go to Marfa, Texas, the location of the Chinati Foundation, Donald Judd's foundation. So we have to go to Marfa, Texas before we move. And then a week later, a friend of mine forwarded an email to me that said that there was a TC1 loom, a thread controller loom, that was being sold in the town right next to Marfa. So of course, I immediately contacted the woman. I didn't think I had a chance of getting the loom. I did not have the money. But she was incredible, and through barter and luck, I got the loom. So, 2007, 2025, this loom is no longer being supported by Digital Weaving Norway that made it. I don't know how many TC1s are available. There are a lot of TC2s now in the world, but my loom is still working perfectly. And so I was so happy. My first weaving, I wove this, jump for joy. It's a hand loom, okay? I stand at the loom, just like I'm standing here, and I throw the shuttle, right? I have 880 heddles on the loom, so that I have 880 threads, and each one is independently controlled. So I can do an image that's completely different from left to right. But if I want a repeat, of course I can create an image that has a repeat. And if you want to see a loom, you can try to make arrangements. I'm sure that they'd be happy to show it to you. There's one at the Media Lab here at Cranbrook. Only I have 880 threads. They have 3,960. So it's much wider and much deeper possibilities. And I want to acknowledge that Vibeke Vestby from Norway, it was her vision, and she still is completely involved with selling the loom and going all over the world helping people get the loom going. She's amazing. The way they talk about jacquard, Mr. Jacquard, who they say invented the jacquard, I hope that the future will remember Vibeke Vestby. So since 2007, this has been my main loom. So when Mark and I lived in a very small town in central Vermont, we were there for 12 years, I did a lot of weaving on that loom. It was a refuge for me during those difficult political years. And at this moment, it's also still a refuge. I did this weaving continuum, which deals with transition and change, and those are big themes of my work, and life, as well as monkey mind. So, monkey mind, the way our minds are always jumping from one idea to another to another. Again, the warp here is also horizontal. So on the loom, I was standing at that end, and I began just with a palette of colors. I'm just looking for it's like a watercolor box, right? And then I identified those structures. And then I changed in the center to shaded satins for those tree branches, which I also think are sort of like brain synapses. And I ended with the natural world, which is overlaid with some symbols of weaving. And I think the ability to change from one type of cloth to another on this loom is just so incredibly liberating. So here's an image of my work that was at the Fuller Museum in 2013. In Nomad, the large weaving on the right, I filled a map of the world with names of places that I've lived or visited. And then I removed the map so only the words were left in the shape of the continents. And then I imposed that image on a photograph of the ocean. And it's really funny because most people read Nomad as constellations rather than tracings of my travel. And then they interpret the weaving above it, east-west, as water, but it's sky. So working with Photoshop in the TC1, I was able to create this large image and then cut it down so I could weave panel by panel. So it became 6 panels to create Nomad. And today that weaving is at the United States Embassy in Mauritania. If we still have an embassy in Mauritania, right? So totally out of the blue, in May 2013, I received an email from Princeton University asking if I wanted to submit a proposal for a permanent installation for Whitman College Community Hall. So, of course, I said yes. And I sent several proposals, including this image, which is my proposal photoshopped into a photograph that they had sent me. So this is not an actual weaving. This is like a photograph. So in my house, there was no room for me to see the full length of any panel. They ended up at 16 feet. So I actually obviously wove more than 16 feet per panel. But when I finished the first panel, the weather was still good, and I could hang it outside to see it. I wove 3 panels with letters, and I wove 3 panels with numbers. And they were the building blocks of how we exchange knowledge, and it really seemed appropriate for a university. And here's the actual 3 panels with the numbers installed. And this is the final image of Stardust, which is permanently installed. So it was a solid year of work for me, and I was just thrilled that the final work looked like the proposal that I had handed in. And I have to say it amuses me because everyone assumes it's a church, but it's a cafeteria. And, Rebecca, who's running the program at Kingswood, took me through Kingswood on Sunday when I arrived. And it was so incredible to go in the cafeteria and see those tapestries that were designed by Loa Saarinen, which I remember seeing before, but I had forgotten that it was a cafeteria. So it made me feel better about my weaving. So I still like studying weaving structures on my loom. I was trying to understand takate and to get it right. And it wasn't beading correctly. So takate, which has 2 warp systems and 2 or more weft systems, it's a plain weave, but you see a 1 weft on the face, and then it goes to the back. And if it's woven correctly meaning historically correct, right? You can do anything you want today, and it's totally fine. But for me, I wanted it to be that way. So you shouldn't see the warp, but you can see in this sample that a lot of the warp is showing. So I turned to tapestry to try to understand it. I enrolled in an online tapestry course taught by Rebecca Mezoff, and she's an incredible teacher. I watched her videos so often that I joked that she was my roommate. I've done tapestry, I've taught tapestry, but tapestry can exist as its own world almost. And I live in New Mexico, where there's a great tradition, Hispanic and Native American tradition of tapestry weaving. So if someone meets you and you say you're a weaver, but you don't do tapestry, no, you're not a weaver. No. So I will say that I was stunned by my response to doing that class. And I was enthralled. My hands were back touching every thread and being involved. And, because I was just doing samples, I didn't have to there was no preconceptions. There was no judgment about what something should be. And I didn't work on I worked on my Maycomber because that was the best for me. A lot of people work on these little frame looms. In fact, I had a little frame loom. I made that at a course that I co-taught at Penland in 2017. In fact, that's where Rebecca Smith and I met, in that class. Behind it, you see an actual jacquard weaving with takate. So I did take what I learned from tapestry and came up with a solution. So of course, what happened was, as the density decreased, as I allowed my floats to be longer, then I could pack them in. I did not want to do bubbling. That is something that tapestry weavers do. So I figured it out. So I realized that I was missing the spontaneity that I could achieve on a floor loom. So when I go to the jacquard, I have to work at my computer, and then I have to bring it to the loom. I have to turn on an air compressor. I have to turn on the vacuum pump. I have to turn on the computer that runs the loom. And I have to cross my fingers, This weaving information, I began at the bottom of the cloth, which is, you weave from the bottom up usually. I mean, you could weave upside down. And I went from takate to samit to lampas, double weave, and then weft back satins. And I could not jump from structure to structure like that on a floor loom. But what I did was, instead of designing the whole thing from beginning to end, I just did one band at a time. And so it felt less restrictive, and it was more inviting to me. This is an inkle loom. It's also known as a belt loom or a tape loom. So the very first loom that I owned was a Gilmore inkle. And I had it with me in all my moves until a couple of years ago. And then I thought I never use it. So I sold it. And of course, the minute I sold it, I thought of a reason to have it. So I went and bought a shacked inkle. And so I wanted to study Andean double weave with some friends. And then I thought, well, this little loom, I can do it on this loom and not tie up my other looms. So it turns out that the inkle was really flexible, and I could do the double weave. And I brought the sample there because you're not going to really be able to see it in this slide so well. But I began with just 10 threads, and I wove a tiny little square, you see it on the bottom left, to make sure that my double weave was working. And then I added more ends so I could do a wider band. The band could be wider. And then I was trying to do a balanced plain weave. So I did a motif, and it wasn't balanced. So then I had to bring all the warps out further, wider. And then it did work. And And then I decided I needed to do a warp face version, so I brought the threads back in closer, and then at the very end it looked nice, right? So it worked, but I was so frustrated because I knew on my shaft loom I could have done the whole thing in one day. I would have known exactly what I was doing. It would be fine instead of struggling with these sticks and how to get the double weave and everything. And so it was clear to me that this kind of weaving was never getting me out of bed and into my studio. Later, I set up the loom for just some simple hand picking of motifs, and that worked just fine. This is a rigid heddle loom, and within a space of a week, 2 of my friends who are not weavers called me and asked if I would help them to set up their rigid heddle looms. So I spent, I spent some time looking at videos, and it's quite intriguing because the way people dress this loom is so different. You don't need any of the equipment that you would need for a regular loom, and it takes up very little space. So I said yes, and it's not a loom that I expect to use in my life, but I helped them. But when I helped one of them to put on their second warp, I managed to get everything wrong. I wound the warp on the front beam instead of the back beam. And then when we corrected that, she couldn't make a shed because I had made the warp so dense you couldn't separate the threads. So my philosophy is that mistakes are gifts. So you learn from them, and you learn how to fix things, and you learn what not to do, right? But I think I gave her too many gifts. So this is my latest loom, or I guess I should say loom part. It's a rigid heddle, and it's got extra slots that are not as long as the normal slots. And you can see Susan Foulkes, Foulkes, who has written a book on hand-picking using this heddle, and also has a lot of good videos online. So she gives information on how to use this heddle. So backstrap weaving, I'm back at my beginnings, right? But I haven't used it yet. And I sort of think I never will, but I really am happy to own it. I love it. So I want to say that setting up my ankle for double weave, it's not the only time recently that I've used the wrong loom for making a project. If I had made this weaving brocade on my floor loom, it would have taken no time at all. But I had my TC1 set up with a black warp, and I definitely wanted that as my ground, so I wove it on the TC1. Those small, colorful shapes, those were woven with silks that I had dyed with natural dyes, and then I inserted them as supplementary extra wefts. So on the TC1, instead of just using my fingers and picking through, I had to create a lift plan on the computer that would allow me to understand where I wanted to put those. It took a lot of time, and the weaving was much slower than if I had done it on a floor loom. I achieved what I wanted, but later I shook my head at myself, like I knew better. It's a clear example where a simple shaft loom would have been a better tool than a computerized jacquard. On the other hand, I couldn't do a weaving that replicates my handwriting like this, a detail from Riff 2, without my TC1 loom. I mean, I know how to handpick, and I know how to create my handwriting, but I don't have time. I don't have time in my life to complete something like this. And also, if I was doing it by hand, I would have to have a drawing underneath my my warp in order to get the real handwriting, to get it just like my handwriting, right? And I would hate that. So once again, I want to mention the right tool for the idea being expressed is important, as well as knowing your own preferred modes of working. So these days, I continue to go back and forth between my floor loom and my TC1 loom, between functional textiles and artwork. This weaving is a deflected double weave, a detail from a blanket I made on an 8-shaft loom. The wefts travel from edge to edge. There's no hand manipulation. There's no dye work. There's no need for color mode changes. It's so clear that a dynamic pattern making is possible to be made on a shaft loom. And anyone who wants to see an eye-dazzling design made on 4 shafts should open up a book on overshot weaves. I still haven't settled on either abstract or narrative as my mode of expression. And in a weaving like this, Eclipse, you can see my love for historical textiles and pattern. Through the gold motif floral on the bottom, it's not a direct copy from an old textile, but it's definitely a nod to one. And the incredible shadows from a recent eclipse that show up in the top, they made me think again of humans throughout history being awed by nature. The braiding and dyeing of my warps that originated here at Cranbrook, almost four decades ago, they still remain an element in my work. And so one of my most recent weavings, Flow, it's woven in narrow strips on a floor loom and then sewn together. It's the braiding that is the weaving. So I'll end with something I often say. A simple, tenuous thread grew into my lifeline. It's all here, words and scribbles and broken ends. I'm lucky to have woven on many looms and have tested the full technology of weaving. And I'm lucky to have the flexibility in my own studio to go from one loom to another, depending on my mood and my ideas. Even luckier is that I found a way of working, weaving, that's so deep, so interesting, so varied, that I remain simultaneously both a student and an expert. It doesn't look like my passion for weaving is going to diminish this lifetime. I wanted a holistic life, and weaving has given it to me. I wish the same for you. Thank you. I can take questions, and we're hearing aids, so Joey's going to help me if I don't understand what you ask. She'll repeat it to me, okay? So, and
I was hoping you could talk more about your painted warps. Oh, okay. I was hoping you could talk more about your painted warps and how you went about them. Like, did you set it up on the loom first, or were you kind of?
Okay, so when I first began doing painted warps, I would have my warp on the loom. I would stretch it out in front, sometimes just in the air, but later onto a table, and then I would paint it. In the very beginning, when I was doing it at KU, I didn't think about the fact that dye travels along the warp. And so there are a lot of looms still at the school that were stained by me. So that's not very good. I've also done a lot of, I've changed over the time. I did different things. But so in the beginning, when I would pull the warp out and then I would paint it, and then, so what happens is with Procyon dyes is that if you wait 24 to 48 hours, depending on the color, it'll set. it'll become permanent. You'll have that chemical reaction. I didn't know that, but my warps were so wet that it worked. Later I went and studied it. I took a weekend workshop at Prochemical, and I learned why it was working. But then I needed to wash the warp before I would weave it, because once the dye was set in it, there was powder, and it could really harm your nose. So I had buckets of, like 6 buckets of water, and I kept going from one to another. So it was kind of laborious, but it worked, right? Later, I sometimes would weave it's like a scaffold weft. Like my weft would go like this, big, angles onto a warp. I could take the warp off the loom. At the very end, I would do a pocket, so that I could then put it back on the loom, roll it back, after I had painted it and everything, right? Had to rethread the loom, right? And then had to keep taking out that extra thing as it was coming forward. But that kept it very, very, so if it was a very specific image, it would stay. But I think there's something very nice about just washes. Yeah, and I haven't painted my warps in a long time. Processes come and go.
Well, it was a fantastic talk, I think, and I really like the concept of thinking about what loom you're going to use, what technology you need, and what's going to do the job the best. I think that's something we could all use.
Yeah, right. It takes time to learn that.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jean. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.